By the way, with introduction, James is an organizational development consultant, coach, certified transactional analyst with extensive experience working in complex organizational systems. And he's also provisional teaching and supervising transactional analysis, supporting development of TA practitioners internationally. Alongside with his TA practice, James worked deeply in organizational development within global corporate environments where contracting across multiple stakeholders, multiple cultures, and power dynamics is pretty much a part of everyday's reality. And on a personal note, James and I first met at Google, where James was working as an OD practitioner supporting senior leadership teams. And now, as a proud ex-Googler or Zoogler, having left company to establish his own practice, it's so wonderful to have him bringing this depth of experience into today's conversation. So, James, once again, truly delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you, Eagle. Thank you for the welcome there. Um, so, a good afternoon to you all, wherever you are joining from. I'm joining from the UK this afternoon, which is absolutely sweltering. It's 32 degrees Celsius, and I don't have any air conditioning, so please just bear with me if I'm looking slightly hot and shiny. It's hard to avoid this afternoon, and I'm delighted. First of all, thank you, Eagle, for the opportunity to share one idea from the world of transactional analysis with you as applied to the world of team coaching. Um, by way of setup, there will be one breakout in this session this afternoon, but there will also be plenty of opportunities to ask questions and raise topics that you might be wanting to do. My suggestion, if that's okay with Eagle, is Eagle, if you can keep an eye on the chat, and then every so often, if we're kind of building up a few questions, then I'll pause and kind of work through those. Because we're a very large group, I might not see if you use the hand raise feature or function just to say. So probably better to put your question in the chat just so I can sort of stay on top of things that way. Okay, so let me just get my slides up. And as Eagle said, I have just been, shall we say, after 11 and a half years in Google, I have been released to my own freedom and independence, very much voluntarily, and something that I wanted to do for a while. I've desired to work with a wider range of clients, but I've had an awful lot of fun working with tech leaders all across Google in the past decade, and lots and lots of different varieties of team coaching work that I've done with leaders all across the spectrum of business activity. So might bring in some of those examples, shielded for confidentiality as we go through this. So my business is called Luminize. That's what I've literally just set up, and it means to cast light or to illuminate potential. So that's what I've just set up. Just literally started about a month ago or so. But the reason I'm here today is to bring in my background and specialism in transactional analysis, and specifically organizational transactional analysis. That's what I've trained in for over a decade, and now have the pleasure and delight of also being able to teach and supervise others in this particular field of TA. I'm now going to do a little bit of unpacking of what exactly TA is, because although I see on the call there are some people who are very highly trained in TA. I've spotted some of people that I know from my training days. There may also be others of you on this call who've never really encountered it or have a vague idea what it's about. So I'm going to do some context setting to make sure that we're all on the same starting page and position. Okay, so let's go to the now, Eagle, you already made reference to contracting, and thank you for doing that. And um, contracting was actually, the term was first contracted within transactional analysis. So there's a bit of fun trivia for you. The creator of transactional analysis was the first person to really actively use this in the context. Now, this is a clinical context, but the coaching community, when it began, really rapidly adopted the language of contracting. So And we say in transactional analysis that it's a contractual method, which means contracting is always at the heart of everything that we do. And what I'm hoping to unpack in the course of this short session this afternoon is a number of different ways that we think about contracting that I hope you can pick up and apply to your practice in whatever way. It does not require deep or specialist knowledge of transactional analysis. These are ideas that are easy to take away. And I'll also happily share a PDF of the slides with Eagle that she'll distribute to this group as well, in case any of you want to follow up. But feel free to take screenshots or whatever as we go through this. One thing I would say is that we have a maxim in transactional analysis that all of our intellectual property is openly and freely available because we want to spread the ideas. We just ask that if you borrow any of the ideas that you attribute the original author. That's the only contract that we ask of. But none of this stuff sits behind a paywall or anything like that. It's freely available in the literature. So I've mentioned most of what's in the contract already. Slides available as a PDF. Use the chat box. One breakout. Opportunity for Q&A as we go through this. And content-wise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ground you in what is TA if you don't know. I'm going to introduce some ideas around TA-based contracting and how I use it when I'm working as a team coach. I'm going to look at a powerful idea of three-cornered and multi-cornered contracts, which is very prevalent in team coaching work. And then finally, I'll look at something called the coaching matrix. And I really want to acknowledge I'm barely scratching the surface here, and I would love to run a longer workshop. And I also respect the format that Eagle you've set up here, which is like a short, sharp sort of introduction to some of the ideas that I work with. Okay, so let's move on to what is transactional analysis. The first thing I want to acknowledge is that it's a really tricky term, and almost when you read those words, transactional analysis, you think, what inspired Byrne to pick those words? Well, because when you hear it, you might think it's something to do with financial instruments or financial derivatives, and it's not. A transaction is an exchange of communication between two people. That's what Byrne meant by a transaction. And the analysis is the analysis of the exchange of communication between people. Hence, that's where the term transactional analysis came from, or TA more colloquially. And Byrne had quite a sense of humour, so sometimes he wanted to attach slightly obtuse words to that. And I suppose one thing it has done is it's made the term quite memorable. Once you've been introduced to it, you don't forget it. So this is Eric Byrne. He lived a relatively short life, and he also created transactional analysis in a very compressed part of that life. Really, he was only writing actively about transactional analysis for about 15 years or so of his life. But what I'm delighted about is that this has not remained fossilized in time. TA has remained active and vibrant, and lots of Byrne's original ideas have been torn apart, put back together, reconstructed, updated, and this updating and contemporary like treatment of transactional analysis has continued until this day. That's one of the reasons that I'm really passionate about this psychology is it's not fixed. We keep updating it to reflect the context that we're in. So that's kind of TA. I think what's important to say here is what you see on the right is there are what we call four fields of application in transactional analysis. So we have the original field was psychotherapy because Byrne was a psychiatrist. That was his training. He was a medical doctor. And initially his application and the development of all of his ideas actually happened in a psychiatric hospital. And this is really significant to the topic this afternoon, which is about teams and groups. Because when Eric Byrne developed his ideas, it was all originally developed in the context of teams and groups. He hadn't necessarily thought so much about this being an individual psychotherapy practice because his practice was with groups. So helpfully, lots of his writing is about teams and groups. And that's why we're here this afternoon, is to talk about the application of TA to working with teams and groups. So he wrote his initial material, but what happened very quickly after he wrote his material was people went, wait a minute, this isn't just applicable to psychotherapy or the treatment of people who have severe mental distress. Some of these ideas are really, really practical for organizations. And the very next place TA went was to begin to say, right, well, how do these ideas work in organizations? And so very early on, this work began to look at TA in the organizational field. Similarly, also applying in educational contexts. So from everything from early years education, secondary education, tertiary education, learning and development in organizations. And then the final field that emerged was the field of counselling. And I think it's really important. I see we've got a number of kind of Europeans on the call. Counselling in TA has more of a European definition rather than the more commonly held Irish and UK definition where people bundle counselling and psychotherapy together. Counselling in TA means around equipping people with resources to help them be more effective in whatever it is that they're doing in life. So typically, coaching also can sit in the counselling field of TA. So when I'm sharing this and you're thinking about, oh, which parts of TA might be interesting here, organizational development and counselling kind of bridge this world that I'm talking about here. So that's another reason I enjoy working with TA. It's a broad set of psychologies that can be applied lots of different contexts. And plus, it's so stimulating for me to I get training alongside psychotherapists and educators and counsellors. It helps me see things much more broadly. So that's just if you've never heard of TA and you've never been introduced to it before, that's the kind of the grounding and where it all came from. Um, so um, the initial work, as I said, was all around psychotherapy. And what you see in this middle diagram here, which we're not going to do today, but I am going to mention it, the original and probably most profound way that most people have heard of transactional analysis is the idea of ego states. And they are depicted on the picture of this book here. And that was really important to Eric Byrne. He was like, everything that we do in TA, you should be able to create a picture. That was a super important principle for him. And the reason for this was, apart from the old adage that a picture speaks 1,000 words, it's also that diagrams are easier to comprehend, easier to access. And he wanted to make TA accessible to people, not something hidden behind dense academic texts or really difficult psychiatric words. How can we visualize? And you'll see that I'll be using some visuals to illustrate contracting as well this afternoon. So that's where it kind of started. He also wrote some other books as well. He very, I mean, I could do a whole session just on Eric Byrne and intuition. That's where he started his work, actually, was looking at the human capacity and power for intuition. And actually, that's something that if you do further training in TA, we spend lots of time on, is the kind of the use of intuition in our practice. So that's why you see that intuition book there. But he also wrote a book called The Structure and Dynamics of Organizations and Groups. That's where a lot of his ideas came from around what we practice when we use transactional analysis with teams. And then he also had this book called Principles of Group Treatment, which is very much linked to his work working in psychiatric hospitals. So that's the kind of the starting point of all of these. By the way, if any of you are ever thinking of going and looking at Byrne's books, what you have to sort of bear in mind is they were written in the 60s. And so there's a couple of issues there. One is the quality of editing is not what it is today. They are not easy to read always. And the other thing I would say is that some of the attitudes that were present in the 60s, such as attitudes to the queer and gay community, towards women, are quite questionable. And the transactional analysis community has done a lot of updating its own materials and its own resources to make it more reflective of the society we live in now. So these are texts that I recommend that you look at only really if you're going to seriously study TA. However, they inform where the whole thing came from in the first place. So one more word before I get on to contracting. So and this is a little bit of a crossover with Gestalt, if we have any Gestalt practitioners on this call. Gestalt and TA are very close cousins. And so we do have a phrase in TA, which is contact before contract. Contact is an idea that comes more from Gestalt than it does from TA, but we've adopted it into our own way of thinking as well. And the way that we think about that is before we can do any work as practitioners or professionals, it's like we have to be in human contact with the person that's opposite us. That's really difficult to do in an online webinar. Obviously, much easier to do when we're meeting in person. But that's why, Eagle, I love what you're doing with your opening kind of question to the group. That's a way of creating contact when you're working online. And that's really important to us. So we don't get down to the business of contracting until we have made sure that we've built some sort of working alliance or relationship with the person that we're working with first. And Byrne liked to use kind of quite straightforward, quite simple language to articulate how to make contact. And he also had a way of articulating, thinking, well, when we meet up with people, we go, well, who am I in this situation? Who are you? And what is this all about? Or another way to put it is like, what do you even say after you say hello? So Byrne brought it back to these really kind of simple, fundamental questions around how human beings think and get into relationship with others around them. So, yeah, thank you, Eagle, for setting up some contacts, and then we're going to get you into a little bit more contact when you go into breakout groups in a moment. Okay, so let's get on to contracting. Well, so before I do that, I just wanted to put this little mind map up for you to say, I could run a 2-day program on the whole, on everything that we would use within transactional analysis to think about teams. And you can see here, this is just 6 concepts that I've picked that would be relevant. We're talking about contracting today. But if I go around the structure, so we've got imagos, which is about the psychological representation that each of us hold about all the teams and groups that we participate in. So imago is the Latin for image or representation. So that's that one there. Public structure is what can we see of this team or group that we're working with visibly or publicly, be it on our organization chart, where they sit, where are their offices, are they a virtual team? How do people show up? Do they show up with their cameras on or off? That's like what's publicly available for us to see. Then we have the idea of group forces. And this is where I would say the systemic comes in. So as transactional analysts, what we're always doing is we're not just looking at the team that we're sitting in front of us who want to do some team coaching work. We're saying, well, who are those teams connected with? What's the pressure or the forces that are coming in around them from the environment, from other situations, from people within their own organizations? So that's the kind of the group forces. We also look at leadership authority. This is one of my favorite areas of TA because it's a little bit like anthropology and archaeology. The ability to go and find out where does leadership authority start and end in this organization is often a matter of history, not what gets assigned to people on an organization chart, and that often gets lost in the organization. People thinking, we just give people this job title and suddenly they will have power and agency and they will be able to make a difference. And in TA, we rarely take that at face value. So that's another area. And then finally, this idea of organizational games. Everywhere, every single organization has games that take place, which is when something is dysfunctional in the organization, how does it manifest and rise to the surface? Well, let's take gossiping as a really simple example or illustration. Gossiping is an organizational game, and gossiping and politics happen in every organization, regardless of sector, politics, whatever. And if anyone says to me there are no politics and no gossiping in our organization, I just don't believe them. They are human phenomenon. They are human dynamics. And I don't mean that judgmentally. I mean, they are simply data that we can access that gives us information about how this place runs. So I'd love to be able to do a 2-day program with you and go into each of these areas, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the landscape where all of this sits. And there's lots of interconnected bits of the TA psychology that we can bring into this. But today we're going to go and do a double click on contracting. Okay, so let's just move on to this. So the most foundational area in transactional analysis around contracting, and this was actually defined by Byrne himself, 3 levels of contracting. So the first 2 will seem, I hope, very straightforward to you and probably things that you all already practice. The third area is an area where we have a particular point of view in transactional analysis, and I would say it's probably the most critical aspect when you're trying to contract or set up a contract to do effective team coaching. So the administrative aspects are the logistics. Who's in the team? When are we going to meet? What's the fee if you're an external consultant? What's the time requirement if you're an internal team coach? What's the frequency of the work? Um, how long will we meet for when we do this work? Um, how will we address cancellations, rescheduling? What's our approach to confidentiality? Is this all a verbal agreement or do we write stuff down? So very straightforward, all the stuff that you would expect, and I would fully expect anyone who works in this field to kind of take care of. So we call that the administrative and transactional analysis, or it could be the practicalities as well. It's like, what are the practicalities? Then the professional aspects of the contract is like, well, what is the focus or the goal of the work? Again, nothing new for any of you here, I'm sure. We all like to agree coaching goals or coaching focuses or coaching outcomes. And in this case, also, I think, and I'll come and I'll share a framework later because I do think there's a kind of a framework that goes from very, very objective professional goals to very emergent. So I know there are lots of different ways of approaching this work. So one way would be to be a more kind of very specific, let's get this smart, specific, measurable. How are we going to know this has succeeded? Very tangible behavioral outcomes. That would be one approach. An emergent approach would be an agree to work emergently to see what comes up as we begin this work and explicitly agree that we're going to have areas of focus or areas to kind of delve into as a team, but we're not going to be in the space of behavioral goals. And both are fine because it's what you choose in your way of operating as a coach or a team coach that matters. You will have your own good reasons for doing that. I'm on the more emergent end, but in TA, we call where we agree what it looks like, what we're focusing on, the professional aspects of the contract. So, but, and, not but, and the most important part from my point of view is the psychological level of the contract. So this, and in transactional analysis, to be clear, and in other psychologies as well, what we are describing here are the unconscious processes that are taking place all the time. And not just the unconscious processes, also the non-conscious processes. So let me just be clear what I mean by the difference of those two. The unconscious would be what is suppressed or held back and not yet known. Okay, so it's not even in someone's consciousness, and until you actually stumble across it and it rises to the surface and can be named, it remains unconscious. And then non-conscious is I've not yet thought this because no one's asked me the question. So it's not that it's sitting somewhere deep in the recesses of my psyche or my soul. It's just I haven't thought about it. So some questions will lead that to rise to the surface. And the other thing that does go on in the psychological level of the contract as well is that people, when they are setting a contract, may think things, but may also censor themselves. So they may not speak as much truth to power as they want to initially. So we as transactional analysts are very concerned with all of this unconscious process. It creates the absolute foundation for the work we do. And the reason for that being the foundation of the work that we do is that it is inevitably what is unconscious that then emerges in the course of the work that changes the direction, changes the focus, changes what we need to do next. So it's the constant emerging. So the way that we think about the psychological contract in TA is administrative can be written down, agreed, check. Professional, written down. You might not be full agreement because we might not have got further enough into the work, but you can still write it down. The psychological, you don't write down, and it's always unfolding. And every contact that you have with the client in the work as it unfolds, new elements of the unconscious will arise. So, and like, let me give you a very practical example. Someone, let's say an HR business partner has said to a leader, you've got problems in your team. Okay, people keep coming to me from your team telling me about problems. They've asked me to keep it confidential, but I think you need to do something about it. I think you need to get a team coach in. So I show up as a team coach to speak to this leader, and something is off in my conversation with the team. Like, so I'm using my intuition now. I can tell something is off when I speak to this leader. That leader has been conscripted or told or directed that they have to do the team coaching. They're not a willing participant. So the contract is not viable. It's not possible for it to go forward until that person that I'm trying to contract with shifts in their perspective or finds a different way to think about the work and goes, actually, I can see why it would be beneficial for me to participate in it. They might go ahead and say, okay, let's have a session, but it could be done on a very compliant basis. And the difficulty with that then is that the work won't unlock or get the team to where they need to be because there is something unspoken, unworded, and not yet in the open around this. So transactional analysts tend to be quite not we're not rude, but we're quite direct in the questions that we ask because we want to surface stuff. So stuff like what is going to impede or sabotage this work? What might be the worst outcome that you could imagine that would happen if we begin this work? And I welcome cynicism, by the way. So when I start this work and I maybe meet a team leader or who's never done this type of work before, they might be sitting there a bit flipping skeptical and cynical. And I'm like, bring it on. Because if you show up with your skepticism and your cynicism, then that's real. And I can engage with it and we can have a conversation around it. And I can check out with you, okay, all right, I'm really glad that you've named that for me. What would help you feel like this work would be worthwhile? So you've dissolved something, you've helped people kind of start to articulate, okay, right, if this is going to be worthwhile, this is what I'm going to need for you. And then I can have a contract with the leader and say, well, I can't do that for you because that's wishful thinking or that's like magical thinking. But what I can absolutely do is I can make a clear contract with you, or I can go and talk to your team members. These are things that I can do. Or you and I can have a very clear contracting conversation before we go anywhere near your team and start this work. So my aim is always to get people into real talk and to surface stuff that might impede the quality of the contract or the quality of the conversation. And I also know sometimes that's not possible in the first conversation. So sometimes because the person sitting in front of me doesn't know, then I need to be patient and I need to wait for them to work it out, or it might not be the right time for them to do this work. So all of this stuff sits in the unconscious psychological part of the contracting. One more thing I want to name, and then I'm going to get you into a breakout group scenario to kind of have a bit of a discussion around how the psychological aspect of contracting shows up in your work. We have this idea in transactional analysis of the psychological leader. And the way that we think about the psychological leader is who is the person that when push comes to shove, people will stop, listen, and respond to their point of view or their perspective? Or who is the person that they go, we need to have their perspective before we can proceed? And the reason I'm emphasizing this is that that person is not always the person that's sitting in front of you. They could be elsewhere in the organization. And you can also get the phenomenon of the psychological leader is not the person that's named on the org chart. It's someone else in the team. And so we hold this philosophy in transactional analysis. You cannot have an effective contract unless you are talking to the psychological leader. Seniority does not always equate to psychological leadership. You'd be really surprised about how people can exist in organizations who have extreme power for whatever reason, for one reason or another. But so this is another thing that we do as transactional analysts, is that we can't know for certain, but we check out what's their influence, what's their ability to persuade people to come along on this journey for them. And sometimes what happens in a team, it's not that, let's say you've got a brand new leader, the rest of the team might look to someone else in the team and they're looking at them across the table and they're going, they need to give them the eye. They're the one that needs to say, yes, we should do this, not let's say, the new leader. So anyway, I hope I've kind of illustrated here the idea of the psychological level of the contract and why it's so foundational. And I want to give you a chance to kind of have a bit of a discussion about that in your breakout groups. So two sort of relatively straightforward questions. How does the psychological level of contracting show up in your work? And what has happened for you when you've tried to contract with someone who isn't the psychological leader? And I don't mean this in individual coaching situations. That's a different thing because one-to-one contracting is different. I'm talking about whenever you've tried to do work in a team or a group context. So Igor, yeah, if we could give people 10 minutes to go and have a chat, and then we'll hear from a few of you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. In the interest of time, what I suggest, I'd love to hear from three individuals just so we get a little bit of a sample from the breakout rooms. So I realize that probably favors those that don't mind speaking up virtually in front of large groups of people. And that's not everyone. But I'm imagining that in a group of 57, there probably are at least three people who are quite comfortable saying a word or two. So if I could, I'd like to invite three contributions around what came up in your breakout group, and then I'll share a little bit more content. So anyone willing to break the fourth wall?
I don't mind breaking the fourth wall.
Good to see you, Tony.
And you, James.
Yeah.
Yes, I think there's something came up in our group about the iterative nature of this and the willingness of the awareness of the team coach to keep contracting as part of all the engagements all the time throughout the work, rather than as it's often described as a process that happens at the beginning and then you just get on with the work. And so that came up, and I think that's so true about the nature of it's an iterative process that needs continual stroking.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Tony. Fully in agreement. Yeah. Okay. So a couple more thoughts would be very welcome.
I don't mind going.
Thank you.
Hi, James.
Hi there.
Claudine. Really interesting conversation with David. And the thing that struck me about his reflections, David, I hope you don't mind if I'm quoting you, was this idea of where that psychological leadership comes from and the power in the room, and it not necessarily being the role. Because I was reflecting that in many of the teams I work with, it has recently anyway tended to be it is the CEO. Everyone, as you described it, everyone stops and listens and turns to them. Whereas David was reflecting that something about it's the people who know what's really going on in the organization, and everyone stops to listen to them. And I thought that was really fascinating and something I might look out for a bit more.
Yeah. There's one thing about kind of the CEO, and like you look to the person who's geographically at the top of the organization chart, and then there's another thing around where are the more subtle areas of power held. So it's that's what I enjoy. Yeah. I think Kirsty, you had your hand up. I don't know if you put it back down again.
No, I did. Thank you so much. It was lovely to connect with Mariana. We're both in South Africa, which was also a good connection. We both do some of our team coaching work in the nonprofit sector, and often the founder of a nonprofit is the psychological leader, even if they're not in the room, and
Yes.
how it can become really tricky to have a team divided in terms of who they see as the psychological leader, and how to navigate that, and what support you can get as a team coach in terms of bringing the team to a sort of a cohesive agreement about who that is.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. And actually, it is something that you also see. I agree in like founder-led organizations, but it can also show up in a team coaching scenario where another individual who's not in the team keeps getting referred to in almost referential terms. And there's a clue that they're the psychological leader, even though they're not even present. I remember I had a scenario like this in Google once, and the people kept referring to this leader, and I said to the team, like, stop me if I'm getting this wrong, but my understanding is this individual led this team 3 leaders back 6 years ago, and yet this person is being talked about in the room today. Can we have a chat about this, please? And it then led to a very productive conversation, but it's like the team somehow had stopped thinking about it, and it was just normal to refer to this leader that they've been working with. So that's also the psychological leader can be someone who's also left the organization or is outside the room. Harder, obviously, then to contract with them, honestly. So it's not that common a scenario, but it can occur. So I want to connect. I'm going to keep us. I mean, I'd love to keep this conversation going, but unfortunately, in the interest of time, I need to keep going. So let me just get the presentation back up so I can share a couple more ideas with you. I'm just trying to get all this lined up. Okay, so So what we have here is the idea of the three-cornered contract. And here what this relates to is actually the conversation we were just having about psychological leader. When you enter or begin to do work with an organization, there's you as the team coach. Sorry, there's me as the team coach in the bottom right-hand corner. There's you as the person that I am contracting with or building the agreement for the team coaching. And then there can be this idea of great powers. So, and the difficulty with great powers is that they can be not necessarily always one individual. They might be colloquially referred to as the exec or the LT or some group of nameless, faceless leaders that somehow hold power in an organization. And that can then become quite tricky because what we think about as a transactional analyst actually is, well, how do I identify who the great powers are? Who actually holds the power? What is the power that they hold? And what is the influence that the power that they hold going to be over this piece of work? And sometimes the power is so extensive that actually it could prevent the work being viable or kind of going ahead. So so that's like this idea of whenever we are putting together a contract for this work, there is almost inevitably someone else in the agreement, even if they're not immediately visible to us. So that's the idea of great powers. We can double click on this actually and go even more deeply. So and Eagle, you'll be very familiar with this. When I was working in Google, I always had multi-corner contracts. I had so many people involved in the stake of the outcome. So there's me as a team coach. HR have got an opinion, but I'm not directly working with HR, which is why there's a dotted line there to them. I'm attempting to contract directly with the client. The client's leadership team, unbeknownst to me, might already be having projections and fantasies about what I'm going to do. Oh God, we've got a team coach coming in. Why are we broken? Or more of those types of activities where we all have to bare our soul and enter group therapy. Yeah, I'm playing along a bit here, but already I am having an impact on the leadership team of the client as well. So that's why there's a dotted line there, because I'm not explicitly contracting with them unless that's part of the work, but I'm impacting them. The client's manager has a stake in this as well. They might have been told to get this work underway or done. I might not necessarily have a direct relationship with the client's manager, although I would attempt to, if I was doing this type of work, have a conversation with them to see what their opinion or point of view is on the outcome. And then I've also put in something that some of you might encounter in larger organizations is sometimes we can have an administrative party we have to contract with who puts their own barriers and obstacles in the way around kind of, I don't know, GDPR compliance or how we invoice or policies that we must submit to or reference checking that we must go through before we can participate. So I'm shown here because I do have to have a direct contractual relationship with them. The client's probably the actual client leader in this situation might be rolling their eyes a little bit going, I just want to do this work and procurement are getting in the way. And sometimes also they can have that view of HR, or HR can be really like very closely aligned. I mean, I've had both examples where I've had the client team trying to keep HR out, and I've also had the client leader being far too deferential to HR, saying, you describe the problem, you're better at it than I am, because it's difficult and it's psychological. And, both of these are challenges when you're trying to contract, because my point of view is my contract is with the leader and whoever else they kind of describe. So I do this kind of mental mapping in my head of who are the great powers and who are all the people that are involved in this contract I'm trying to set up. Doesn't mean I need to go meet them all, but I need to be aware of them because they will have an impact or a kind of an outcome on the project. So that's the idea of the multi-corner contract. Again, some of this gets at the psychological layer of what's going on when we're trying to build a contract. So, and I realize this has been an absolute kind of blast through a load of concepts. There's one more idea I want to share before we have 5 minutes at the end for questions. So this is an idea that connects more to what I was describing at the beginning around, do you like to work very kind of objectively and, like, let's say, in a more scientific or behavioral manner, or do you like to work much more emergently and to see what emerges as we undertake this work? And there's no judgment here, because as team coaches, we will also encounter clients who show up in different spaces as well. So some of our clients might be very, very focused on, I need measurable outcomes. I need to have this down in KPI language or in behaviors. And, when we're doing something like this, when we finish it, I want to be able to measure that what you said was going to happen is going to happen, right? So that's a very kind of technical, almost kind of, well, you call this kind of a behavioral outcome in this one. It's very hard kind of outcome measures. We can equally encounter people who are like, I don't quite know what the problem is, but I need some help to unblock something. So that would be the clarifying part of the contract. It's like, I know something needs to change, but I don't know what the problem is. Can you help me unpack that? That would be in the clarifying box here. The exploratory one is that, and this is my favorite type of team coaching work. This is when I already have, let's say, a growth mindset. I know that team coaching can be beneficial, and I'm up for the journey. I'm up for exploring kind of with you where we're going to get to. And this might sometimes happen as well when a team is saying, we've got a new mission, we've got a new strategy, we've got to update the way that we're working on particular items. So what we need to do is to start by exploring. The growth and discovery contract is, this team's doing okay. We've got no major issues, but I think we can be more impactful. So this is kind of like a positive growth orientated contract. Again, one that I love working with, but not always that common, I have to say. And then you get the one that I've already described, the behavioral outcome. So a problem gets very clearly defined, and then we're going to do very concrete steps to work towards it. So you as a team coach might have a preference for any one of these four. Your client might have a preference for any one of these four. And another way that you can think about contracting is getting into that conversation with the client to say, what is your expectations of this work and where we're going to, and how objective and measurable and behaviorable do you want the outcome to be, versus how much do you want this to be an exploration and a growth process? Both can be okay in the way that we think about this. So this is another lens to think about how to approach team coaching.